Okay, so welcome everyone to our workshop on React. Today, Christian's going to show you like the first steps to building an app using React. So today we're going to be building a to-do list, and Christian will be showing you how to do that using VS Code, Node, and React. Okay, so I'll hand it over to Christian now.
Give me 1 second. Oh my goodness, that is really zoomed in. All right, tell me if things are like too small and I can zoom in further. Let me do that in my terminal. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna create a new project. Yeah, so yeah, you know what? There you go. It's asking me the same thing. That must be a Node 15 thing. Okay, cool. While that's working, I'm gonna pull up the chat. Yeah, so this will take a second. So start by running this command. Npx create React app, and then I'm going to call it to do app, and I'll put that in the chat just to make that.
Wait, Christian, do you want to first show them like how to I assume if they're just getting started right now, they're at like the very beginning of their terminal. They're at like the user area, the tilde area. So do you want to show them how to navigate to a certain area and like create that app?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So you're gonna open your terminal, and I have a different default folder set. But if you do like print working directory, which is pwd, it'll tell you like which folder you're in on your computer. I mean, okay. So yeah, if you wanted to put it in a specific like folder, you can like. I don't know like what the fastest. You can really put this in whatever folder, and then I guess they can move it to wherever they want later. If you want in a specific folder though, like I guess you can, at least on Mac, like I have like my like downloads folder. You can do like with a tilde slash and then downloads, or like I guess maybe desktop would be a good place.
I think desktop is like a safe place.
Yeah, so I guess maybe you can do that. I'm not entirely sure what the commands are on Windows, but if you get like stuck like finding this directory, I think with Finder you can also just like you can grab folders out of Finder and just like drop them in here. So that's kind of I guess like a quick hack. It'll give you the full path, and then you just hit enter. But once you're in there, create React app, at least when you run this command, it'll actually create a folder for your project. Sometimes you run tools and it just kind of spits out files everywhere. So you might want to create the folder for your project and then run it. But for this, like it works really nicely. It creates the folder for us. So as long as you have like a folder that you're comfortable like putting this on, maybe downloads would be a bad idea because you might like accidentally delete your downloads. But desktop's probably a safe place. So if you change your working directory to desktop, again, you can type that in manually, or if you're on Mac, you can just drop it in from Finder. That's a fast way to do it. And then you would run npx create React app to-do list app, which I put in the chat. And that will take a little while. And then when it's done, if it succeeded, it should give you kind of instructions to how to get to this folder, which is you can change working directory to that folder. I don't know why that didn't work. There we go. And then it'll give you instructions to start it. I have Yarn installed, so it defaulted to Yarn, but I'm going to run npm start.
And if you're caught up, just give us like a thumbs up to make sure you're caught up. And if we don't see a lot of thumbs up, we'll start backtracking a little bit.
Okay, should I proceed?
I think we're waiting on a couple of people. So is anyone stuck? Feel free to like, we're a small group today. So like, if you're stuck at any point, just let us know. We're just doing this to help you guys out. So if you're stuck or having issues, we understand. So just let us know. So if you're caught up, make sure you give us like a thumbs up sign.
I'm also going to, I'm going to paste in the repo too.
Sure.
I guess if you get stuck, like you can like look at the source code yourself.
Yeah, so to the question, so besides Node, what else do we need to download? So the only thing you need is, I believe, is Node, and that's the only thing we'll be using today, right?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, the Node, like the way you install Node kind of varies platform to platform, but for Mac or Windows, I mean, I don't think anyone's probably using like Linux. But for Mac and Windows, just installing that like main Node installer should install everything that you need, which would be npx, npm, and Node. I think at the end of the install command, it just says it installed npm, but it seems like if npm is installed, npx is also installed. Like they're kind of, I guess they kind of treat them as the same thing. So as long as you have both Node and npx installed, that should be all you need. I know some people like yesterday's meeting had like trouble installing like a global package, which we don't really need to do for today's presentation, but at some point like down the road, you're probably gonna want to figure that out. But for today, we're not gonna worry about that. Once you have this started, you should be able to, I think sometimes it auto opens this, but for some reason it didn't do it for me. So if I just paste in the URL it gave me, which is localhost port 3000, it should give you this like spinning React logo, and then it kind of tells you what to do, or prompts you to start editing app.js.
Yeah, I think we can proceed now. I feel like
Yeah.
At this point we've given them enough time. So yeah, just go ahead.
Yeah, so we mentioned this yesterday too, but I'm just going to say it again. There's kind of a few different files here that kind of set up the React project and kind of just like start React DOM. But you should, I guess, like just kind of for now, just treat app.js as like the root of your app. But you don't really ever touch this, or like very rarely. It kind of just starts React. So this is kind of like the root of our app, and it even says like, hey, edit source app.js. So like that's kind of where you're going to be doing most of your work, or at least like the root of your project. You might import like other components from other files later. But for today, we're just me working in app.js. So if I open this and I start editing this, you should see React has fast refresh, they call it, built in, which will refresh your app as you're saving it. So you shouldn't even need to reload the page, which is actually really helpful later when we start having like stateful stuff. It won't like reset your the state of your app like when you start like inputting stuff. So it makes it really nice to edit your app later. We're also going to be editing the app.css file. So I'm going to open this. I'm going to kind of just clear out some of the stuff that they have. I actually don't need any of this, I don't think. And I'm going to delete this, and it's going to look kind of ugly for a second. So just kind of give us like the bare bones, I guess, of our project. And again, if you just, yeah, so we can render whatever there. Okay, so I'm going to start off with, today we're going to be using, they're just like built-in like CSS styles. There are like, I think I also mentioned this the other day, there's a bunch of different ways to style your React app. And the way I'm doing it today is just to kind of keep things simple. And it might not like scale as you have a bigger project. You might want to look into other ways, but for today, just to keep things simple, we're just going to be using like just a plain CSS file to style our app. So I'm going to start off by creating another div element, and we're going to call this to-do list. And the reason I'm doing this is like later on when we style stuff, I just like want to be able to kind of center stuff. So just wrapping this in next to your development makes it kind of easy to style stuff later. If you've done like any sort of web development before, this will look familiar to you, except that instead of class, we're using class name because that's how React. I think I also mentioned this the other day that a few of the style or a few of the attributes will differ from just plain HTML, and class name is one of those. So it's just kind of something you just need to remember. It might be a little annoying if you've already done some web development. So we can just throw whatever in here, or whatever HTML tags at least. So I'm just going to call this to-do list. If you're familiar with HTML, this is a heading 1 tag, which kind of just makes like a heading element as opposed to like a paragraph element, which would be like smaller text. So this will be kind of just a nice like title for our app. I'm going to, let's see. I'm going to add, I don't want to get too into like CSS styling. If you want to you can probably even just copy paste this part, because I think CSS is kind of a separate thing that like it takes a while to learn. So I'm just going to kind of add some styles just to kind of make things look a little bit pretty. But if you want to just copy the styles, at least from the link that I sent, I think that like we could probably do a whole other thing on CSS alone. I just kind of want to focus on the React part today. Let's see. So essentially what this is saying is this is going to have it center my app, just kind of make it look a little pretty, I guess. And I made this so it also like will be like a little bit responsive to. Every once in a while it'll throw this error, and you might actually need to reload the app. So fast refresh is not perfect, but it works most of the time. So again, yeah, you could just copy and paste these styles. I think in the repo I had a lowercase app. As long as these match, that shouldn't matter. So I'm just gonna make this just to match the repo that I sent, make this lowercase. And then let's see. And then for to-do list, I'm gonna create another style. And we're just gonna say with 100%, and then max with 400. Yeah, oops, sorry. So again, I'm not going to get too into like why I'm doing these styles exactly. I want it to be like responsive, so like, that's kind of why I set up some of this. But again, like CSS is a whole other thing. So now we're going to start to get into. Has everyone like gotten this far? Let's see, I just want to check the chat.
Yeah, how's everyone doing? Does everyone have the code loaded up? Well, Christian, could you? I'm not sure if they know how to like do the split screen VS Code. So I think you had that set up before. So show them
if you just drag a file over, it'll first show you how to like replace the current file you have. But if you keep dragging it, it'll show this like highlight the side of it. And then if you drop it, it'll do a split screen. You can do as many as you want, I think, or I don't know if there's a limit. I've done like 3 before. But for now, I mean, we're just editing 2 files. So you could just drop that in. There's also, just a pro tip, I didn't realize that this button was here for a long time, but there's a close all button, which is awesome because for the longest time I was closing every file manually. It was horrible. So when you're done, if you want to close everything, that's awesome. But yeah, if you just drag that over there like that, that'll let you open a split screen. Okay, so now
just let us know if you're caught up. Just give us a thumbs up sign. If anyone like gives us that thumbs up sign, that's a good sign. Okay, cool. People caught up. Yeah, I feel like so far we haven't really covered too much information, but make sure you're caught up now and you know what's going on now, because it just gets more confusing as we go. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to just for visual, just throw in a horizontal rule. That's just like a little divider, and you can. This is for I think this should be just a normal HTML thing. You can just you can do tags like this, which like lets you put content in them. I don't think horizontal rule even lets you put content in, but as a shorthand, you can just add a slash to the end like that, and that closes the element. It'll throw errors and like yell at you. It'll like if you're using VS Code, at least it should highlight this by default and be like, you didn't close this tag. But there, so if you throw that in there, and again, fast refresh gets angry sometimes. And I'm going to just throw in, yeah, using the default style for horizontal rule is fine. I just kind of hate how this looks, so I'm just going to throw in my own style. Or oops, that's for the H1 tag. Again, this is all like these styles are not super important, but they're in the repo. If you want to just copy paste some of the styles. Yeah, okay, cool. So then now I want to get into, I think I'm gonna do the input first to add. Yeah, you know what? I'm gonna do the to-do list items first. Okay, cool. So this is like kind of where we started to get into like React specific stuff, because up to this point, this has kind of just been like HTML, CSS stuff. I'm going to create an items variable. And we're using React hooks for this. This used to React used to. Oops. I'm gonna close this so you can see like the whole line. React useState is a React hook. This is kind of a new way. Oh, you know, I gotta import. So first you should import React to the top. And the way you should do that actually is import * as React from React. You used to have to do this for every React file, but they actually recently changed it, so you don't need to do this for everything anymore. But once you start actually referencing React, you're going to need to do this. So you should type this at the top and just import React. And also you might see like some guides that don't have this, but they're kind of moving towards like this is the new standard. You should do asterisk as React. So this is how you should handle React imports, or just importing React in general. And if you're going to use like useState, you're going to need to import React. So once you add this line, you can type useState. And so this is the React, the function component way of handling state, which is we're going to do everything with function components tonight. So essentially what useState does is it creates, so every time something like changes here, it'll rerun this function, which will re-render your app. And essentially useState lets you maintain state in this variable, even if this function is called again, as opposed to like if I was to just like define something and like, I don't know, like if I just set it to like a random number or something, that would lose state every time it's refreshed. It would be a new number, and I would lose what that number is. But using the useState hook, that allows us to maintain state through every re-render, which is good if we want to like put in our to-do list items or something. So essentially, if you call useState and then you pass in what you want the initial value to be, which in this case is just an empty array. And so essentially what this function does is it returns two things. It first returns the value of the data, and then it returns a set function. So basically this is sort of a getter, but it's not a function, it's just a variable. And this is a setter function. And what's cool about this setter function, you don't want to, the way that React works is you don't want to mutate this directly. So you'd never want to do like, I don't know, something like that. And actually, yeah, React will actually, this is a nice thing about Create React App is it actually has a lot of like linting stuff built in. So it'll actually yell at me if I try and mutate this. It'll say, although actually, that's because I defined it as const. Yeah, so essentially you don't want to mutate this directly. You want to call this set items function instead. So if we wanted to mutate this, we could call set items. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to store our to-do list items in here. So we're going to start off with this being empty. You know what, actually, I'm going to throw some initial data just to make testing easier in here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put an object in here. And I'm going to, I think what I did was, let's see, we're going to give it an ID, a title, and a check value. So we're going to say ID is 0, title is test, and checked is false, because we don't want our item to be checked initially. I'm going to delete this later, and we're going to be able to manually create these, but just to make this easy to start off with, I'm going to add just this initial data. And does that make sense to everyone? I think it's going to make more sense as we start to use this. But has everyone got this initial like state set up? All right, I'm going to assume they did. Okay, so
yeah, just give us a thumbs up sign if you're all good. I feel that just helps the best. So anytime he asks, Christian asks a question, whether you're caught up, just give us a thumbs up sign, and that'll let us know. Okay, cool.
So if we were to like console.log items right now, it would be set to this array of this one item. So what we can do with React is we can, so essentially the way that this templating like JSX works is if we wanted to pass in a value, I could do like a string like this. And you see that, which is the same as just like for strings, I could also just do it like this. But essentially what this allows us to do is this allows us to render variables, which in this case, items would be a variable. So if we put items in there, since it's an array, we can use the JavaScript. I hope that, I'm not sure how familiar people are with React, but map allows you to, I think map is pretty common in other languages too. Essentially allows you to iterate over an array and map a value to a different value using a function. So in this case, this is our initial value, but we want to map this too. So I'm going to take item, which essentially item will be set to, it'll iterate over this array. And in this case, we only have one item. So item will be set to this initially. And then I'm going to pass in item and the arrow function. And then passing in parentheses just allows me to like, whatever value I pass here, like if I pass, let's see, if I pass test, it'll render the number of, so if essentially it's iterating over this. Right now I'm not reading this data yet, but if I had 2 of these, it would render test twice because it's iterating over each element of this array and then rendering out whatever this function returns. So in this case, what I would rather do is maybe I want to render item.title, which is also test because I didn't name this well. But let's say we name it. See how creative I am with the names. There we go. So now it's iterating over this and then passing in that title and then it's rendering that. But that's not really helpful. So we want to do something a little bit fancier than that. So essentially we want this to look like I want to have some text for my to-do list item and then maybe a checkbox over here. And then I want it to be able to click on the checkbox, but then also maybe click on the title of the item and it'll check or uncheck my item. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let's see, since we have multiple items in a row, I'm going to create a div element, which will kind of just let us wrap these into one HTML element, kind of like make a row of both of our items. And the first thing we're going to have is a span tag, which is just kind of like a generic text tag, unlike H1, which has a header style applied to it. Span just it's kind of styleless, I guess. And then we're going to, this is just kind of formatting stuff. You don't have to hit return. You could just pass it in like this and do item.title. But just this is kind of the convention that I use, is just formatting it like this. And then I'm going to put an item.title. This extra space, it gets ignored. So it's just going to render in span whatever the item.title is, which in this case is test2. And then I'm also going to put an input. And input, we're not passing text directly into it, so I can close it like I did with horizontal rule. So if you type input and then put a slash, and that closes it. And again, it'll throw an error if I mess that up. It'll be like, hey, you expecting a closing tag for input, and that means that you forgot to close input. So if I close that, that works again, and you see we have input there. So we want a checkbox though. We don't want like a text input. So what we're going to do is type and checkbox, and then that should convert this into a checkbox, which is cool. And then I'm going to quickly just add, let's see. Again, we need a way to target this element to style it. So I'm going to add class name, and I'm going to add to do item. And you know what? You might just want to the style sheet that I had, maybe just paste in all of the styles that I had previously, which is in this folder in the repo. I'm going to send this again in the chat, just because again I don't want to get caught up too much on styling, since that's kind of a different thing. So if you take all of these, I'm just going to paste these in, and that way I'll make sure I name everything the same way in here, so it matches up to the app.css file. But if you look, I already have style set up for to do item. Which makes it look fancy. Yeah, so that's how that's getting targeted to that. Okay, cool. So now we have a title and an input, which again is not really helpful. The other thing too is we're not, so essentially HTML kind of has state by default. So HTML is remembering that this is checked or this is unchecked. But right now React has no idea that this is checked or unchecked. So it's not really helpful, because we want React to know whether it's checked or unchecked, so we can do cool things with this checkbox. So what we're gonna do, and we have a place to store whether it's checked or not, which is this value here in the item. So what we're gonna do, I want to mention this one thing really quickly, and the reason that I have ID here is you're supposed to, again, I'm just kind of doing this for formatting. But when you iterate over an array of items, you're supposed to pass in an ID. And React will actually complain in the console about this. It won't really error out. It won't throw a red screen. I don't know if it's the red screen of death, maybe, whatever you want to call that bad screen. It won't it won't crash your app like that, but it'll in the console, if you were to open this, if I didn't put that ID in, it would complain and be like, hey, expected. I think it should. Yeah, there you go. It'll be each element should have a unique ID. So just be careful every time you iterate over an array of items. And you saw that I forgot to do it before and it didn't really matter, but just for performance issues, you're going to want to have an ID, and this should be unique. It'll also complain if you have 2 elements with the same ID. So usually if you're like calling an API, like a database identifier would be good here. But for us, like we're just creating local data, I'm just going to create, like, I'm just going to increment this. So we make sure it's unique. All right, let's see. Okay, so now we want to be able to read the state of this and be able to like write to this input state, so we can actually control or like read whether it's checked or not, and write to it as well, like programmatically check this. So we're going to start off by the thing is where there's going to be a few different places where we're going to want to handle checking. So I'm going to create one function called handle toggle, and that's going to take ID as an argument, which will be the ID that we defined here. And that way we can kind of call this in multiple spots and then check or control whether this item is checked or not, as opposed to just like having this code in multiple spots in my JSX. So what we're going to do is, let's see. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to want to, eventually we're going to have multiple items in here. So we're going to want to be able to look up which item it is. And I'm going to add a second item. Now I'm going to rename these to like 1 and 2. And I'm going to just pass that in as, yeah. So now we have 2 items, and essentially I want to be able to target an item specifically we want to check. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do, let's see, I'm going to set index variable, which will be the index of our item. And we're going to find that by items dot find index, and then item ID. And then basically what we're doing is we're looking for, so it's kind of similar to, I guess, not really similar to, but sort of like map where it iterates over the array. It's going to complain that it's not a triple equals because JavaScript sucks. It's going to iterate over this, over the items, and essentially going to, like, once it finds an item where the item ID is equal to the ID that we pass into this function, it will return that index. And I believe it just does that for, it should just do that for 1 element. Yeah, so the first element, again, VS Code is super helpful. If you hover over these functions, it'll give you an explanation. It'll return the index of the first element where the output of this function is true. So in this case, it'll be true if the index matches the one that we're targeting. The reason that you need to do triple equals, JavaScript will do weird things with double equals. Basically, just if you're not a JavaScript person, just avoid double equals for now until you like, and even later maybe. But if you don't understand JavaScript, really just try and always do triple equals. Or if you have like a does not equal, you do 2 equal signs. Yeah, again, this is what I was saying earlier. React has like a lot of really nice like linting features built in. You might need to enable linting in VS Code. I'm not sure if it does it by default. But if you have linting set up, I can explain if anyone wants afterwards how to do that. It'll kind of catch these like nice little, or these errors for you if you do make a mistake. And React is actually written in a way where it's like makes it very easy for it to kind of help you out, which is awesome. But now we have the index of our item, which we got based on passing this in. Now we're going to, so like I said earlier, we don't want to mutate this directly. We don't want to mutate items directly. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone this. So we're going to do const items clone, and we're going to set that equal to items dot slice. If you do slice 0, that'll essentially make a clone of our array, of our array starting at the index 0, which is the first element in the array. And if we don't specify a second index, it'll just go to the end of the array. So that'll give us a clone of our array. And so then we don't need to worry about, now we can mutate this without worrying about actually mutating this accidentally. So at this point we want to, so now we know we have a clone of our items that matches whatever state is in this. Again, this is just the initial state. This might change later on, but we have an index or a clone that matches this, and we have the index of the item that we want to change. So at this point, let's see. I'm gonna save this in a variable just because I like I guess naming things. So selected, and we're gonna set that equal to items clone, and then now we can pass in this index. And so, okay, so let's say I was to call this, we're going to call this soon, but let's say I was to call this with item 0, which I'm not actually going to do yet, but let's say I called it with 0. That would pull this out. We have a clone of this now, and then we have selected would be set to this item here. So now we can kind of mess with this and modify it if we want to. So what we want to do is, so essentially this is a toggle function. So what I want to do is I want to toggle if it's checked or not. So now if I was to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to items clone. And then index. And then I'm going to set this to, if we do, this is called the spread operator, and it allows us to take selected. And essentially what I just did was I don't know why React is angry. There we go. I took whatever was in this value, which is just basically set to itself. And then basically what I just did was pointless because I just set this to itself. So for the spread operator, you could see that we have, this is nice too, VS Code will show like what the data is in here. We have ID, title, and checked. So essentially I just pulled out ID, title, and checked and then put it back in here. So essentially that's the same as just sort of like putting that in there, which is pointless because, but what we really want to do is we really want to modify the checked. So what I can do is I can basically say, instead of having to worry about passing ID in and then passing title in and then passing whatever, I can just say pass in everything except I want to override checked. So that allows me to override one thing. And then in this case, we could take selected, since this is set to the element that, I guess we'll call this like the target element. Since this is set to the target element, we can take that and then take checked. And then we're going to just invert it. So if it's true, set it to false. And if it's false, set it to true. So that essentially lets us toggle it. I know that was kind of a lot. Hopefully that isn't too confusing. We're going to get to use this function in a second, and it's going to like be really cool, I promise. Okay, so now we're going to, now we can call set items, and we can pass in our clone. So essentially what this does, again, the whole thing, it cloned it, it modified the item that we were targeting, and then it set React to the clone of it, of the data. So now we can take this function. Okay, one thing I want to do really quick, just so we can see the result of this, is I want to go back to input. And then, so right now, this is what's referred to as an uncontrolled input. React's not controlling the value of it. So I'm going to set value equal to, or actually, I'm sorry, for a checkbox, I believe it would be checked. So I'm going to set checked equal to item. And this is a, let's see, this would be a Boolean. So if I just pass in checked, that should work. And I broke everything. Okay, cool. So now at this point, since this is now a controlled input by React, if I was to click this, nothing's going to happen because essentially this will always be false, and we're not doing anything yet when I click on it. So it's just like this is forced false sort of. So like now we kind of broke it, but it's going to get better, I promise. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to first take, I want to be able to, so this is the div element here that, excuse me, this is to do item, the div element that's wrapping it. It kind of wraps this whole row, and div has a, let's see, an on click function. So, and then, sorry. So for this, you could just pass in an arrow function like we've been doing, except I'm going to pass alert in. Just so we can kind of see how this works initially. So that's just an on click, and then you passing in a value, and that value is a function, and this function calls alert. So now if I'm to click this row, it'll trigger that alert. Cool, but that's also still not really helpful because we want it to actually check when we click on this. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to finally get to use this handle toggle function that we made, and I really hope this works. Okay, let's see. So we're going to pass it item ID. Oops. And if I did everything correctly, this will pass an item ID. It'll call handle toggle. And as it's iterating through, it's passing in the ID for each of these. So no matter which one we click, it should be able to target whichever one we clicked on. And there we go. Cool. That worked. So I can click on this row now, and it programmatically changes this checkbox. We still can't click on, oh, actually we can click on the checkbox. Okay, cool. Yeah, so that worked. If we weren't handling, I'm gonna actually do this anyway. There's a reason why. Yeah, so this is what I have in the source code and the code base anyway. We're gonna have I'm gonna comment this out for a second just so we can kind of see what's going on here. So now this doesn't do anything again. So if for input, if I do onChange, which is the value called when you change an input, and I just want to get people kind of used to working with like these onChange like events on input. We're gonna do this again later, but we can call the same handle toggle function with the same ID, since like we're still within this iteration of map, we have access to this item ID still. So now if I click on checkbox, it checks it. And I'm gonna basically, now we have two ways to check it. We can click on the row or the checkbox. As we saw earlier, this will actually, if we don't pass this here, it'll fall back to the row element and that'll handle the check. The reason I want to do this though is, first of all, I wanted to show you how to pass in a non-change function into input, but also for accessibility reasons. If I tab on my app, you can see that I can select these inputs with tab, and it's actually not working. You know what? We need one more function actually. We're going to need an on key press function, and this is also in the repo as well. We're going to need event, and I don't know why it's showing that's. Oh, by the way, if I don't know why I did that for a second, but if you see if you see that it's crossed out, that means that is a deprecated feature, which means that it's a language feature that will no longer be supported soon. I don't know why I did it there because that's not deprecated. But if you ever see that, just a helpful hint, that means that that's a function that might go away, or a language feature that might go away eventually. But in this case, we're taking event, and then we're going to do if event key equals enter, which means if they click the enter key, we're going to say, again, this is why I defined it in one function, so we can call this again. I think you might not need this. This might be redundant, but I'm just gonna leave that in there just in case. And essentially the reason why is, like I was saying earlier, if you have someone that's like some people prefer to use a website with a keyboard, namely like accessibility, or people that like can't use a mouse. So this allows you to check boxes using just the keyboard, which is just kind of a good thing to keep in mind when you're building websites, just to kind of do like, not everyone is using like a mouse pointer and just like a computer the way that like a developer is. So it's good to kind of support these features that are built into the browser, which is like allowing people to select and check things like so. And there are other keys that you can read here. In this case, I just want to read the enter key because that's the standard one they use, but you could read other keys as well. Yeah, okay, cool. So that takes care of the to-do list item. I also I'm going to add, this is just a stylistic thing. It's not super important. I'm just going to paste this from the repo because again, this is not super important, but I'm just going to say item.checked. I broke something. There we go. Okay, cool. So this is just going to cross out our text when you check it, which I just think like looks kind of nice. Okay, so now what we're going to do at this point, this is, if you're looking at the repo, this is a little bit different than what I've done. I'm going to come back to this later and refactor this at the end. But I want to move on to the actually entering in our own data into this. So what we're going to do is we're going to, let's see, we're going to set up within to-do list, we're going to put a form element. The reason we could probably just put a input element and without a form, but the reason I like to kind of lean on like HTML built-in features is because, again, like a lot of sometimes you build something that just kind of works in one case, but you don't really think about other cases. And like the browser has like it'll handle a lot of stuff by default if you just kind of using the built-in HTML and JavaScript features. So like by using a form, for example, like it allows people to submit the form by hitting enter. So maybe you might build an input that lets you like submit it if you click a button on the screen that says like submit, but people also expect it to submit if you hit enter. So by using these built-in HTML elements and features, you kind of get a lot of like the browser behavior that a user would expect by default. So I encourage people to kind of lean on these HTML features like form and stuff, and kind of not try and build. I guess it's good to build custom solutions that understand stuff, but it's also good to kind of lean on browser features. So in this case, we're going to use form. and we're going to pass in, we're going to do another input. And again, you can just kind of close it like that because input doesn't take like a text value like this would. And in this case, we're also going to define, we want this to be a controlled input. So I'm going to go back up to the top here, and I'm going to set, we're going to use useState again, and we're going to set react.useState. And we're going to set it to just an empty string. And we're going to call this input val and set input val. So essentially what this does is this allows us to, first of all, control the value of our input. So right now, if I was to type this, this is an uncontrolled input. So I can just like type whatever, except that I hit a button. There we go. So I can put whatever I want there, but we're gonna pass in. So for a text input, instead of check, this is going to be called value. So we're gonna pass in input val. And so now you'll see whatever we passed into the initial state gets set in here, but we can't actually type in this because this is a controlled input. So what we need is, again, I'm going to set this to an empty input or empty value rather. And then what we need to do is we need to read the on change event. So similar to what we did up here, we're going to read on change. Except in this case, previously we assume if it's changing, it's just toggling it. In this case, we actually need to read the value from the input. So what we're going to do is we're going to take event. I think I called it E in the repo, but essentially E was just short for event. And then you can pass in. We can basically event will give us access to event, target, and then value, which is the value that we're typing in the input here. And this is just something you kind of just have to remember, that it's called event target value. You can just refer to documentation. I mean, a lot of people don't remember these nuances. Like a lot of React developers and people like need to refer back to documentation about this stuff. So this is just something you just kind of have to remember, that for the input on the on change, you have event target value. VS Code might provide helpful information. I think it might, it'll tell you that this is a string. It might help you out with remembering this stuff. So essentially now we have the value of the data that we're putting in here. So if I, for example, typed like the letter T, we don't see it, but it's calling this with the letter T, or whatever value is present in this input plus the key that you just pressed. So what we could do is we can take this and we can call set input val, which is the function that we defined up top, which is our setter for input value. And essentially we're calling it with this, which will allow us to actually put that in. So it seems like, because again, if we were to originally, we could type in this and it would work. And it seems silly that we're like controlling this, like it seems pointless because we broke it and then we fixed it again. But essentially what this does is it brings this component into the React ecosystem, or I don't know if that's the right way to say it. It kind of basically reactifies this component, which allows React to both set and get the value of this, which is what we're going to want to do. Because when you actually type something in here, I'm just going to quickly add a class name from my style sheet that we had earlier. Just bear with me 1 second. Form, yeah, that didn't happen. Okay, cool. And then we're also going to add because right now if there's no value here, it just looks invisible and you can't actually see it as there, which is super annoying. So we're going to set a placeholder, which is just kind of a visual thing. Say what needs to get done. So, okay, so here we have an input. We can type in it and it saves the value. And then when we hit enter, it does nothing because because it's a form, it's going to actually reload the page, which we don't want it to do. So now we want to actually do something with this value when they submit it, which would be to take whatever you typed in here and then append it to our list of items and then essentially log it or put it in here as a new uncompleted to-do list item. So what we're going to do, and if we use form, essentially when you hit enter on an input, it'll submit the form, which is why when I hit enter, it actually reloads the page because the default value is to you would like specify a like a backend or an API or something that it would like post to, and it would post that data. But in this case, we want to actually handle that with JavaScript. So we can disable this default behavior. which I guess feels a little bit intuitive. But again, the reason I'm using a form element is because it has a bunch of I guess it's easier to kind of use the built-in HTML features and then kind of just disable the little things that you don't need in some cases than it is to build this all from scratch. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take form, we're going to say on submit. And then we're going to take, this also has event. And in this case, I'm going to define, I need multiple lines. So I'm going to put curly braces. We're going to take E and then, or event, sorry, and then say prevent default. So what this does is it says prevent the default browser behavior for submit. So now when I press enter, it doesn't do anything. You can't see that I'm pressing enter on my keyboard, but I promise I'm pressing enter, and it doesn't do anything. Which, okay, cool. So now we've taken control of the submit function on form. So now we need to handle what it does. So first off, we're going to say if input val does not equal empty, because if it's empty, then we don't need to, excuse me, if it's empty, then we don't need to do anything. I'm actually not even sure if it'll let you submit it on if it's empty. So this might actually be an unnecessary check. It's good to, I guess my opinion would be like, it's good to have these kind of safety things in here because different browsers will handle different things differently anyway. And there's like so many different browsers out there. Like it's good to kind of check and make sure this stuff is what you expect it to be before you, as opposed to just calling the submit or the submit code that we're going to put in. So I just want to do this like little safety check and just say whether it's not an empty value. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay. First, the easy thing is we're gonna say input value. We want to clear this when we submit it because at this point we've handled whatever it is, but we actually still need to handle what that is, which is appending this to our array of data. So what we're gonna do is we're going to take, let's see, if we do this, we can. I'm just gonna set this up as an empty array initially, and then I'm gonna show you what we're gonna do with it. But I'm going to use the spread operator again and spread items into it. So essentially we just, you know what, it might actually yell at me if I don't do this. So we're gonna call set items with this array, but we haven't actually done anything with this array yet. So essentially I'm calling set items and then I'm passing in, this is basically the same thing as just passing in items directly, which like that is completely pointless. But again, what I can do is I can use the spread operator to take a new array, spread the previous items into it, and then that will allow me to define a new item. This is kind of newer JavaScript syntax. You could also do, essentially this allows me to clone the array and then add an item instead of going through this whole process of like cloning it and then appending an item, which is just more steps. And I think that this is kind of like more visually explanatory. I feel like it's kind of, once you kind of get used to the spread operator that it lets you clone the items and then override or add whatever you want at the beginning or the end, it makes it very obvious if I start typing something here that I'm adding this to the end of the array, to the end of this array. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm creating this array, spreading in the previous items, and then I can pass in, oops, Adobe is trying to update Flash. Okay, so then I can pass in whatever I want here, but I'm gonna want this to match the format of what I did up here. Otherwise my app's gonna like crash because these values aren't gonna be here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in a new object. And I think what I did in the repos, I install the package. You know what, actually I do want to show you how to install a package. So I'm gonna do that really fast. So the package that we're using, I'm just gonna stop the React app for a second. You could do that with Control-C. So the package I'm using is an npm package and it's called UUID. So I'm just gonna do npm, yeah, I'm gonna do npm install. Again, if it used yarn, this could cause issues later, but this, like, we're just kind of testing this out, so this isn't really an issue right now. We're just gonna install UUID, and then for npm, you have to say save. For yarn, if we were using yarn, you wouldn't need to do save, but since we're using npm, you need to manually. Basically, what this does is it says install UUID, and here I'll drop this in the chat. It says install UUID, and then we want to save this as a dependency for our project, which means that if we go to package.json, it will save that as one of our dependencies, in addition to the dependencies that the create React app script added by default. So essentially what this means is like if I was to hand this project off to somebody else, like a colleague or I don't know, a friend or someone, and they were to run npm install, it would install all of these dependencies. So the project, if all goes well, they should be able to just put it on their computer, install everything, and then run the project the same as you would, which is kind of awesome instead of having to manually install each package if we weren't to save it into package.json. So now that we have that saved, and if you ran this, it should have completed pretty fast. I'm going to just do npm start again, just to restart my project. So now that this is installed, this is just from the UUID documentation. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to input, they had multiple versions of this function. So we're going to import version 4 of it, which I think is the latest version of UUID. We're going to import that as UUID version 4. So it's similar to the import stuff we did earlier, except that they have, I guess, they probably have a version 3 and a version 2 as well. So this just kind of allows you to specify what you want to import from UUID. And so then we're going to take this function and we're going to pass this into ID. And the reason I'm doing it this way, you could probably also just call like math.random or something and just generate a random value. Or again, if you were like using an API, you might want to like use a database identifier. Essentially, you just need something unique for ID. And that's because, again, if for this, we're using the ID to set the React ID. And if we were to just use something that wasn't unique, React would get mad at us and throw an error. I have seen people before pass, you can get the index of the array element using this, and then I've seen people pass in the index element. The problem is that if these array items get rearranged, the index won't change, but the items will have changed, and then React like won't know what to update. So that's why like you should always use a unique identifier. If you didn't have a unique identifier, you could do something like title, and then you could append the index to it, and then that would ensure that it was unique. It wouldn't be super performant because essentially you might get like unnecessary updates, but I'm trying to like kind of show you guys like best practices. So the best practice would be to use some sort of unique identifier. And so just because kind of, I guess, like a hack, we're just going to use this UUID function, which just generates like a unique identifier every time, or it's like whatever they're using under the hood is like probably time-based or something. It's like ensured to always generate a unique like string of probably like I don't know, at least like a dozen characters, which should be more than enough to use as our identifier. So that's why I'm using this. And then we're also going to want to pass in title. And I'm going to come back to this in a second. And then we want checked to default to false because we don't want our item to be completed, obviously, when we're just adding it to our to-do list. For title, what we want to do is, so this is what I was saying earlier, when we put something in this input, we need React to be aware of this value. So essentially, now that I've typed this, now that it's a controlled input, every time I type in a character, it updates input value with whatever's in this input. So now input value should have the value of foo. So now when I actually create this, I can pass in input value, and that will set the title of my new element to the value of foo. And then I'm clearing this because I'm not going to add the same item twice to my to-do list. So just intuitively, I think it makes sense to clear it at the end. I think that's all we need to save elements. So let's see if I do this now. That didn't work. Okay. Let me see where I went wrong. Title. All right, I'm going to just debug this really fast if I add. Let's see if I just hard code this value. If I say, okay, that works. Maybe I just need to refresh. Yeah, okay, that totally worked. I don't know why that didn't work the first time. Maybe I just needed to, it might have been a case of fast refresh failing again. But now if I reload my app and I put something in and I hit enter, yeah, there we go. Now it saves the value and I can check that like I did before. Okay, so at this point, our to-do list app essentially is everything we wanted it to do. Here's the thing though, is that most of your React projects aren't going to be just one function like this. You're going to want to, because if you just built your entire website as one function, like it would be a ginormous function, it would be a mess, and you would have no idea what's going on. So a huge part of React is building different components. So essentially this function is a React component. But what I want to do is I want to show you how to build a reusable component that you can use across other places in your React app. So what we're going to do is we're going to take what we did for the to-do item, and we're going to break this out into its own component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by creating a function to-do item, and it's these React element names need to always start with a capital letter. And it's usually like you start with a capital letter and then each word is capitalized. That's the naming convention. If it's not capitalized, I think JSX will like throw a weird error. The only thing that's not allowed to be capitalized are these like built-in HTML elements. Otherwise it'll get mad at you. So just make sure you capitalize whatever you, in this case, I think to-do item makes sense to name it. And just initially I'm going to return null because null is a value that can be returned from a React function or React component rather. So just so it doesn't throw an error on me. Okay, let's see. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to pass an item now, but we're going to actually have to do something with this because we haven't. Sorry, you know what? I'm going to come back to this in a second. So what I did was I took the code that we had previously, which was this, and I cut it. And then I passed in to-do item instead. And now I'm going to come up here and instead of null, I'm going to return what we did earlier, except that none of these values exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, so what we could do is this has to be an object, or we're deconstructing the object rather, and we could take item directly, which would be totally fine, or at least it would work. I could just take item and then pass an item. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm taking this value, passing it in here into this prop, which is coming in here. And just to avoid confusion, I'm going to name to-do item maybe, or something just to show you that these are different. These could be named different things. So I'm just taking this value and passing it in as a value here. And then whatever this is named up here, this is coming in like that, which is essentially how like all these other properties are handled, or like it's similar. The naming or like the method of inputting this stuff is similar. Obviously React or HTML is handling these values as opposed to our component where we're custom handling these values. So there's one thing you want to avoid though with React. So essentially for this item, we're passing in an object here. So just to kind of show you, to make this easier to visualize, I'm just going to pass this in directly. Essentially what we're doing is that, and I don't want to get too into like object reference and stuff, but essentially if I was to do in JavaScript, and a lot of languages, if I was to do something like that, that would be false. These aren't the same object because essentially like JavaScript saying if this object is equal to this object, which it isn't because they're actually, even though they have the same the same data, the same properties and values, they're not actually the same object. So this comparison would actually, it would fail, or I guess like maybe fail is not the right word, but essentially like even though it looks like it's equal, it's not actually equal. So that actually, when it comes to React, the way that you actually, there are ways that you could check whether those two objects were equal. You could, which I'm not going to get into now, but essentially what React is going to do is they're going to do a comparison like this. So on our, so kind of like this, where these values could change. Whenever this value changes, it forces part of this function to re-render, which is this part. So it's not re-rendering everything, or it's not re-rendering it to the DOM. Rather, it's just re-rendering just this one part. You don't need to really worry about what the DOM is. But essentially, React is smart enough to only update what needs to be updated. But the problem is, if it's an object reference, and that comparison will always fail, it'll always re-render the entire thing. So it's just better practice to try and, or it'll make your life easier in the long run if you try and keep these values as primitives, which I'm not sure if that means anything to you guys. But essentially like a string or a number, so like not an object and not an array, that'll kind of just make your lives easier. And so since all the values in here are primitives, like we have a number and then a string and then a Boolean, which is also a primitive. If we were to just pass these values in directly, it's going to make our lives like a lot easier, or it's going to keep our app more performant. You might not notice a difference, but like as you build a bigger app, you'll start to notice like performance issues and stuff. So I'm going to pass an ID title.
Christian, could you also show us again how you made the to-do list object, the to-do list item?
Yeah. You mean the component?
Yeah, the component.
Yeah. So okay. So I created a function named to-do list item. There are a few different ways to define a function in JavaScript. I just kind of like this the syntax, but we were using the arrow syntax earlier. But for this, I just kind of like using the function keyword. So I'm going to define it as to-do item with a capital. Again, this has to, the only really restriction is this has to be a capital letter. If this was like to-do, like that wouldn't work. Or it would fail when we passed it in down here. But if you define this, maybe don't even worry about this for a second. Just as long as like whatever you return here, if I was to just return, let's see, like, I don't know, whatever. And I broke something. What did I break? Oh, okay. I just had to refresh it. Again, fast refresh is good, but it'll fail sometimes. You just need to refresh the page. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm iterating over these items, and then for every item I'm passing in to-do list or to-do item. And right now, to-do item is just returning an H2 tag, but we don't want it to do that, obviously. But my point is that whatever you return here will get rendered. The one restriction is you can't return two elements like this. What you need to do is you need to wrap it in one element, which would be a div tag. Or if you didn't, we're not really going to use this in this project, but if you wanted to, essentially these will add more elements to the actual DOM in the browser, and like this is kind of a wasted element if we don't actually need the div elements. So you can add a what's called a fragment and kind of basically return two items without actually wrapping them in an item that gets appended to the DOM. But that's kind of advanced. We don't really need to worry about that. But essentially, my point is that for a component, all you need to do is just have that naming convention for the title, and then whatever you return can be JSX like item or like a H2 tag. Again, it could be null. Like I said earlier, that's a valid return value for React component. It can also be undefined, I believe, but it's actually better to, because if you think about like the difference between null and undefined, null means that like I intended to return null, and like undefined is kind of an unintended undefined, if that makes sense. Or that's kind of how I think about it. So whatever you do with your React component should be intentional. So like null should be, for example, maybe we're like hitting an API and like our data doesn't get returned. If it's like a 404, we could return null for that component. Maybe that means that, hey, the data wasn't there. Intentionally say that like this doesn't render anything. So I would recommend keeping the return value of your components to either null or some sort of like JSX output like this. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. Otherwise, I think as you use components more with React, it'll kind of make more sense with as to like good practices and stuff. So essentially, I'm going to paste in, again, the code that we did earlier, except that we don't have any of these things now. So, okay, the way that these props work, I'm also just going to quickly pass in checked. I think that's what I called it in my example. I just want to make sure I'm kind of, yeah, checked. And I'm going to call this to do item and then checked. And then we're going to also pass in we're going to forward handle toggle. Again, these names don't need to match. I'm taking the value of handle toggle and then passing it to here. I just want to I'm going to call it the same thing. And then, okay, so up here, these values that we're taking down here, I'm just going to convert convenience, just copy and paste it up here, just so we can see what's going on. Oops. Okay, so these values that we're taking, we're deconstructing this object. Essentially, what we could do is we could take props. Oops, I hit caps lock. We could take props like this, and then we could read props.id, for example, or we could read props.title. We could read all of these individually. But this is pretty common. You'll see the deconstruct syntax, which essentially what it's doing is it's going to take that props object and it's going to pull out ID. We can pull out title. Essentially, we can pull out whatever we're passing into it. We can pull out checked, and we can pull out handle toggle. Another way we could do this is if we had props, we could set this equal to props, and we're going to want to say like let or const up here. And then we pull these values. It's going to complain that I'm not using these, but if we were to use them down here, if I was to, I'm going to delete item because we name these slightly differently. This should all match the repo again that I posted earlier. But essentially, yeah, we can deconstruct props and then we get all these values that we're passing in. But just for kind of convention, I like to put that in here. which lets us deconstruct that as it's coming in, if that makes sense. Again, I had to remove this prefix that I added earlier of the item, or the, yeah. So we're essentially, we have these primitives directly now instead of being in that object. I think I need to refresh again. Okay, so what we should have now, I don't think I broke anything. Let me see. If I put in something now, yes, okay, cool. So everything works as it was before. The only difference is that we now have this split into a separate component. So you could start to do things like you could put this component in another file if you wanted to. Another reason why you might want to break out a component is there are libraries that let you test individual components in your app, because you don't always want to test, like, it's good to do like end-to-end testing, which is like testing your entire website. But you might want to kind of, I've kind of seen this or heard this described as like the Henry Ford assembly line, where you build your website out of a lot of different components, and then you test each component really, really well. So for example, maybe we want to test to do item thoroughly, like without having to test the entire app. So we can kind of define tests or have be able to test these individually. So there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to break these out into separate components. Like one example might be testing. Like I said, you'd essentially break things out into components, and then the idea is that if you test all of your components really, really well, they'll integrate together really well. But you also want to test your app altogether. And then, but in addition to like testing, breaking your item or your app into multiple components just kind of lets you, I guess, like if you have each component's kind of dedicated to doing one thing, maybe like for example, this is a to-do list item. This is just something that I just created for this presentation. But like as you start to build more and more React apps, I guess you'll kind of get a feel for like what should be its own component maybe. And it's not like there's not like a one answer. It's kind of like just what you think makes sense as a developer. It kind of helps you name things, and it helps you just kind of excuse me, like I guess kind of make sure each component works on that like a smaller scope before you, like, instead of trying to build your whole app as one component. So it might seem kind of pointless that we broke this into its own component, because it did work fine before. But as you kind of build out your projects, you're not going to want to build it as one component. And then, like I said, we could even put this in. I'm not going to do it for this project, but if we wanted to, we could put this in a different file and then import it from another file. Another example might be you could define like a router at your app, which would let you like handle like, I don't know, / like home page or / like, I don't know, maybe you have an about page. So you can have these different functions be your pages and then route them to a different React component based on like what your URL is in your browser. So again, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why you might want to break things into multiple components. But for this is just kind of to demonstrate. I'm going to delete these initial items that we put in, since we can now enter in our own data, and we don't really need that like initial data in there. So now if I like put data in, that all works. This is cool. I think we still have a few more minutes. So I just, should I leave time for questions, or do you think, can I do like one more thing and then we can open up to questions?
All right, you can go ahead. We can go a bit over, it's fine. So you can do whatever you want now, and we can open it up to questions later as well.
Okay, because I also want to cover like one more React hook. This is pretty cool, but the problem is when I refresh the page, it loses the data, which is like super annoying. If you imagine your to-do list, maybe that's a feature actually. Maybe you want your to-do list to disappear when you refresh the page, and then everything that you had to do is gone. But let's assume that the user wants to actually save that data and remember what they needed to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to call the one thing I'm just going to mention quickly, that these React hooks, the way that they work under the hood, if you were to do something like you could do something like I don't know, maybe for example, like I said, if you have a 404 error, you might have like some function that like checks if that, and then you can return null early on if that data is not there, which for us doesn't make sense. But the problem is that you can't call React hooks conditionally. So your hook should always be at the top of the function. And if you were to, you could, I don't know, maybe return there's a million reasons why you might want to return something different rather than this, or like you might want to conditionally return different values. But whatever it is, these React hooks, which is hooks always start with this use prefix conventionally. So whatever these hooks need to go above any return values. And I think I think VS Code should show you if there's an error there. But essentially we're not returning anything up here, so that's not really an issue for us. But I'm going to call React .use effect. And essentially we're passing in a function here. Oops. And then I'm going to pass in, we actually don't need to pass this in. If we just do it like this, I'm just going to call console.log and then use effect. So just so we can kind of see what's happening here. So if we go to console, we can see that use effect was called. And I think if I was to like make a change to this, yeah, use effect would be called again. If I was to, let's see, if I was to type some data, use effect would be called again. So essentially every time our component renders, in this case, use effect is being called. But in our case, we actually just want this function to, I'm going to use this for something in a second, but if we pass in an empty array, we could pass in stuff like input value, in which case every time input value changed, use effect will be called. As you can see it in the console here. I might not be zoomed in enough. There we go. Every time I type something, it's updating. This is the dependency array for use effect. It's updating this dependency array, and then it's recalling this function if this value changed, which in this case, since we're typing, it is changing. I think if I hit enter, it shouldn't. Oh, it does call use effect actually. Oh, and for some reason, key is broken. I might need to come back to that in a second. But essentially, if we just put in an empty array, what this is saying is call use effect when my component mounts and then when it unmounts. I don't think in our case, the component won't actually be unmounting. So essentially when I load the page, the component mounts and we want to call a function here, which let's just say alert. Be careful putting alert in here because it might do it over and over again and it'll like, it could like be annoying. But essentially I just want to demonstrate that when we load the page, it's calling alert, which just means this component mounted. And so in this case, what I want to do is, let's see. Actually, I take back what I said. I do want to pass in items here because essentially I want to call this function every time items changes, which is every time we add a new item to items. And that is not how you spell one. So every time this changes, I want to be able to save this data somewhere. So when I reload the page, it persists. So in this case, what I'm going to do, let's see. I'm going to say, I'm going to use local storage for this, which is just kind of a not secure, but like just kind of easy place to save some data. You never want to store like a user password or something here. But for us, like this isn't confidential information. So I'm just going to take our data and the data in local storage, this needs to be a string. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our items and we're going to call JSON.stringify, which essentially will just say convert this to a string. So for example, if I open console and I pass in just some random object, it'll turn that into a string, and then we could take the string and then we can call JSON.parse, and then we can convert that. That didn't work. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to, it might not work if you, there might be, yeah, you know what, it's mad about the double quotes, but if I was basically to do this function and then undo it, it'll basically spit out the original object that I passed in. If I was to change this to single quotes, I think that would have worked. But essentially, I'm just trying to demonstrate this allows you to convert your data, the items data, to a string, which allows us, that can be saved to local storage, and then later on we can convert it back into an object. And the reason we have to do this again is because local storage data has to be a string. Otherwise, if we try and just save it as an object directly, it'll get mad at us. And so, okay, so now we have this item saved, or this data saved, but we're not actually retrieving the data. So I think if I go to local storage and I look at, there's other data here from other stuff that I was, from other projects. Again, like I said, it's not really secure. So that's why you don't want to like save secure information to local storage. But to do items is the data that we're saving here. And you can see it's empty actually. Oh, I know why. Okay. Yeah, cool. So now once we type this in and we save that, you should, if you look at, it looks like I forgot to, I'm going to go back to this in a second. If I look at local storage, oh yeah, there we go. To do item, if I look at to do item, it saved our to do item there. You can see the unique identifier that generated and then the title of it. The problem is when I reload the page, items is cleared and then it's resaving those items again and then overriding it. So now if I look at that again, dot to do items, that's empty again. So what we need to do is we need to retrieve that now when we reload the page. So essentially, like I said, this is the default value for this. So I'm going to, the issue is that if to do items isn't defined initially, it'll throw an error. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a try catch statement. So just, I'm going to try and retrieve the data. And then if it doesn't work, we don't really need to do anything if it doesn't work, just assume that that information wasn't defined. So I'm just going to leave an empty catch statement. But what we're going to do is I'm going to define this is an empty array initially, and then I'm going to pass the initial items into this useState. But what we're going to do it here is try and retrieve it, and if it works, it'll update initial items with the previous data. So if I say initial items equals, and again, like I said earlier, we need to convert this back into a JavaScript object from the string that we saved it as. So we're calling parse, which is like the reverse of stringify, and we're just gonna the same value. We're calling it local storage to item, and we're parsing it to the JavaScript object and then reloading that back as the initial value into items. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully this works. So now if I type my item and then I reload the page, you can see that persists. Yeah, cool. So now we have a persistent data. The issue is that there's no way to delete these items. So I think what makes sense to me intuitively is if we take if we filter out the items that were finished and don't save those ones, maybe. So what we can do is items dot. I'm going to clone the. I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit fast here, but I'm going to clone the array quickly and then just filter out item and then just say if item dot checked if it's not checked. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm cloning our items, filtering out anything that isn't checked, and now we're only going to save the items. Oops, we're only going to save the items that aren't finished. So essentially now if I reload the page, that's gone. But if I have 2 items and I check one and I reload the page, now it only saves the things that aren't checked, which again, this just kind of makes sense to me intuitively, not saving the items that we already finished. We could add some way to delete items manually or make it a little bit more complicated, but just to keep this kind of simple. I just want to briefly address, we're just about done at this point. I just want to address again, this is the error that I mentioned earlier. The keep crop, when I converted this into a component, I forgot to add that back. And it's just gonna, it's not broken, but it's gonna throw this error if we don't fix that. So what we should do is, ID is our unique identifier for it, so we can just use that as the key. And this is like a special prop. This won't get forwarded to here, so we can't actually like call key. That doesn't get passed to this component. That's just kind of telling React that, okay, like here's the unique identifier for this component. And then now when we reload this, it won't complain anymore because it has that identifier to know like which component is which. And again, that's kind of a performance thing. It'll help when you have a bigger app. I think that really covers everything that I wanted to go over. This should match everything that I have in the repo now. Yeah, so I guess if anyone has questions, hopefully I might have gone a little bit too fast at the end. Hopefully people can keep up.
And yeah, that's totally fine. If you guys ever missed anything in between as well, we'll be uploading this workshop to our YouTube channel in like a week or so. We just kind of want to give like the people who came here like an advantage, so we'll be uploading it in about like a week. So if you ever missed anything, you can go check the YouTube channel. And Christian has put in the repo like a couple times in the chat. So we'll be putting that in the YouTube description, but you can like save the link right now, put it in your notes, and you can refer to it as well if you're trying to like put in something that if you missed anything. So if there are any questions, we can take some as well. Christian can answer. Any general questions about React, any questions specific to the workshop, he can answer either one. Yeah, so there's a general question. You could answer that, Christian.
Yeah, so it's easier to create websites using React or using JavaScript, HTML, CSS on its own, I guess. And I guess that's a kind of it's hard to kind of say without knowing what your project is. But I would say if it's like, if it's anything like more complicated than, I don't know, just like a single page website with like some static content, like I think something like React makes sense. Because essentially like a lot of the web, or at least like a long time ago, I think even now, I'm not actually, I want to say like 3% of the web uses React or something like that. It's like, I think it's small, but it's like, that's like obviously a huge number of websites still. And because like a lot of the website like used to use, I might be off on that number, but a lot of the websites used to use jQuery was huge. I think it still is huge, which essentially would let you, it kind of was like a set of utilities built on top of JavaScript that would let you kind of update things easily and do stuff. The problem was that I guess like reactive programming, what it does is it makes sure whatever the value of your state is, which is like these, which would be these, in this case, items and input value, and make sure that whatever the user sees visually matches whatever the value is of your state, which is huge. Like when you start to have a bigger project, because like basically like in the past, what you'd have to do is like whenever you updated these values, you have to manually say, okay, take this value and then update whatever the element is here. And it was just like a huge pain in the butt. And it also just kind of like the more manual work you need to do, the more room there is for error. So I guess the whole point of React and just like reactive programming is to kind of take that responsibility away from the developer and kind of just say, hey, like just give us the data and then we'll take care of actually like managing the DOM itself and putting those elements. Again, you don't really need to know what the DOM is, but essentially like instead of manually updating these, React will kind of handle that for you. So it'll automatically re-render this if your data changes. So it keeps your data and what the user's seeing visually in sync with each other. And that's just not just a React thing, just like reactive programming in general will do that. So I guess like that's kind of a roundabout answer. Like in some cases, yes, it might make sense for you to use JavaScript, React, and CSS like by themselves, and it's good to learn that, and you can do some really cool things with like CSS. It's gotten really powerful over the years, and you can really do some really powerful things using just those on their own. But as you build a bigger project, a lot of this tooling will kind of help you like keep your project kind of more manageable and kind of help you find bugs and keep it, again, like I was saying earlier, like for example, if I was to delete items here, React will tell me, hey, you forgot a dependency. And in this case, if I update items, it doesn't know to resave them to local storage. So React kind of has a bunch of these safety features built in. And I think there is like a performance hit to using some of these as opposed to just kind of updating things directly. But it's kind of, I guess, like front end's kind of trade-offs. And in a lot of cases, I think if you're building a bigger project, something like React or Vue is another big reactive programming framework, something like one of those like really makes sense, I think. And that's kind of why a huge number of websites have adopted React and Vue and kind of other competitors. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Could you give us some examples of like some companies that use React for their websites?
Yeah, actually, let's see. I'm just gonna pull up their
I also put a link in the chat for like a web course. It doesn't cover React, but if you're like just trying to build up your fundamentals in HTML and CSS, and also learn a bit of like what Christian mentioned with jQuery. So if you want to learn a bit of jQuery as well, I put in this really good web course. It's called Responsive Web Development Essentials. It's taught by this guy named Daniel Scott. He teaches a lot of Adobe courses like Photoshop and Premiere. I learned a lot of stuff from him. He's a really good teacher. So if you're interested in like learning HTML and CSS, I would go ahead and take that class. It's on Skillshare, so I think you need an account. But I think they have so many things on the internet now for like coupons and stuff. Like I'm pretty sure like every single big YouTuber out there has like a 2-month free trial. So you can look out for those.
Yeah, so if you look, unfortunately, I don't know why React doesn't have they might have a list somewhere in the documentation. Obviously, Facebook and Instagram are using React. WhatsApp is using React, which is obviously also Facebook again. So Facebook is the big three using React. But the awesome thing about this, again, is that Facebook will test features internally and then kind of make sure they work out most of the bugs at Facebook. I think Facebook, last I heard, they have something like 20,000 React components, which is just absolutely crazy. I'm not sure if those are all for Facebook.com or if that includes like Instagram and stuff as well, but like 20,000 components is crazy. And then that also means that like when they update versions of React, they need to make sure that like realistically you can actually update your project to a new version, because if you have to update 20,000 components, like chances are basically like it kind of, they need to go through the pain of using these tools before they send these updated versions out to users. So like not only are they like testing out bugs and stuff, but they're also just kind of seeing if this is a manageable framework that like you can actually update and stuff and try out new features. So Facebook is testing these on all their main platforms, it looks like, at their scale, which is pretty awesome. But then there are other things like it looks like Yahoo, New York Times is using React. There actually is actually I don't think I have it installed on I just switched to Microsoft Edge from Chrome. But if you have this React like React Dev Tools extension, if you install that, let's see, this will tell you which website using React, and it also provide you with a bunch of just like really great React debugging features. So I highly recommend adding this to your browser. I'm going to do this really quick, actually. So if you were to go to a website that's using React, like in our case, Yeah, okay, cool. So it says this page is using a development builder React since we're actually, we haven't built this yet. Oh, that was one other thing I wanted to mention, but I think we don't have time. How to like deploy this to? It's super easy to deploy your React app like to the web. But in this case, we're using just we're running this in development mode. But if we were to build this, then it would say, hey, you're using a production build React. So these developer tools are just super helpful. And they'll also tell you like if another website is using, let's see, if we're using, I think Medium uses React, I believe. Yeah, cool. So if we go to Medium, it'll light up this like the color, and it'll be like blue as opposed to, it'll be like grayed out if it's not using React, and it'll say, hey, Medium's using a production up-to-date version of React, which is just kind of cool. You can kind of, if you install this, like not only is it great for debugging if you're doing React yourself, but it'll kind of like show you which websites are using React, which is just kind of cool to know. Let's see, there are other companies. I guess another cool thing is like Airbnb, because I think like Airbnb has contributed a lot to React, I believe. So a lot of these companies, like it's cool to have these big companies behind React because a lot of them are actually contributing things to React that I think, I don't know what Airbnb contributes, but I think one of them contributes like a router maybe. It might have been Airbnb, it might have been a different one, but like they've kind of these big components. I wouldn't say React is like missing them. React just kind of like, I guess they want to keep the core of React just really focused. I would say that I wish they had a better way to style stuff instead of just plain CSS. But I guess the React want to keep it simple, and so a lot of these companies have built their own tools and like libraries on top of React that work really well, and they kind of provide like documentation, and you can test those out for yourself. And then there's also Next.js, which is built on top of React. So if you go to they have a much nicer showcase of websites using Next.js, things like Fortnite, Hulu. I think it looks like Netflix itself is using React. I think Netflix Jobs uses Next.js, which is like, if they're using Next.js, they're also using React. So this is kind of stuff built on top of React. Nike, there's just a huge number of Ticketmaster. There are tons of huge websites that are using React. And it kind of makes sense because like at the scale of these websites, you want to use something that's like really manageable, which React is. Again, because it's been demonstrated at like Facebook scale that they can manage it at that scale. So it'll really work for really anyone, I think. Regardless of like if you're a smaller website or a huge website like these. So that's why you see lots of like smaller companies and big companies using React. Hopefully that was your question for like who's using React.
Yeah, I think that's about it. That's all the time we have tonight. Thank you all for coming. A lot of you stayed, so thank you for that as well. Yeah, so if you haven't joined our Discord already, I put it in the chat. Just join our Discord so you can just stay up to date with anything we announce, any meetings, announcements regarding the accelerator and stuff like that. So join our Discord. And yeah, that's pretty much it for today. I'll stop recording as well.